Hi, this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy. On today's episode, we had Matt Zand to help us through understanding what Hyperledger is and specifically how it integrates with smart contracts and public blockchains. Matt recently published a book on Hyperledger Fabric, version 2, and I wasn't going to miss an opportunity to bring an expert on the podcast to talk to us about what it is. He breaks down the different libraries, we talk about smart contract and public private blockchain integrations. While there's been a lot of attention on public blockchains, what is often covered less are private distributed ledger technologies and how they can integrate into the public blockchain. For example, as we move towards a world with central bank digital currencies and the overlay of compliance tech on the public blockchain, inevitably the interdependency of private and public blockchains is going to become front and center. I have a lot to learn about Hyperledger, but from my vantage point, it has the advantage of being battle tested in enterprise environments. I would anticipate that if you want to understand how medium to large non-crypto companies are going to ultimately interact with the public blockchain, you might want to understand their existing Hyperledger implementations. It would also appear from the vantage point of supply chain management hard to see how public blockchain can deliver on security, resiliency, and systems integration in a way that Hyperledger's implementations can. So I was really excited to start this journey with Matt. I've got another Hyperledger focused episode in the hopper, and I hope that this podcast can continue to advance your understanding of this critical component of the encrypted economy. As a side note, the video in this episode is terrible. Particularly toward the end, I felt like the crypto punks NFTs had better pixelation than what we were getting. Fortunately, the content more than made up for it, although my video editor is going to have a fit. As usual, if you like the podcast, share it with others. If you're connected with the Hyperledger community, make sure to share it there too. So I think you're really going to enjoy this podcast. And with that, I bring you Matt Zand, author of Hyperledger Fabric 2, the book. And I think you're really going to get a lot out of this podcast. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. So this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy, and today we have Matt Zand on the podcast. Now, Matt just wrote a book on Hyperledger Fabric and the latest version. You know, we covered a little bit of Hyperledger on this podcast when we had Janine Hightower-Solido and Corey Wendling from Atomize. And we also talked a little bit about private blockchains, which is or distributed ledger technologies with OneChain, which focuses on cross-chain applications in the public-private space. So it's high time that we did a little deeper dive on Hyperledger, and very excited to have Matt Zand today to help us through that. Now, Matt's done a lot. He founded 4 companies. He's got that new book, and I'm going to have to figure out how to summarize everything he does succinctly in my title byline because it's going to be a challenge. Maybe I'll just use a huge acronym. But at any rate, without me endeavoring to do justice to your background, Matt, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your background.
Yes, thanks, Eric, for having me in your podcast. The thing is that my background in business, I graduated from University of Maryland, College Park. I got my MBA, and then I have been coding since high school. I started a technology company, and then after that, a couple of brands we add to it. In 2013, we started a web design company called DC Webmakers. And then after that, we moved to the mobile app development. And around 2019, we did some stuff with blockchain, which is called Hashflow. We also find out that it's very good to have a training along the application consulting and development. So in 2015, we started 2 brands of training, one for high school kids called High School Technology Services, and another for adults for coding bootcamp. So that's where I'm coming from. So mostly technology, kind of the companies. Now, as you mentioned, recently, like last 18 months, I was engaged in writing a book on Hyperledger Fabric, which today we are going to talk more about that. That's where is my background is. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So Hyperledger particularly, what drove you to focus your efforts on Hyperledger and to go ahead and write a book on it?
When I was starting doing stuff in blockchain, believe me or not, we couldn't find a teacher in DC area that knew to teach the Hyperledger in 2019. And also the resources for Hyperledger was such a scattering around. There was no very single source of resource that you can rely on. Different version, different community people. So the lack of good resources, also the trends in blockchain adoptions. As you notice, one of the early adoptions or early use case of blockchain was supply chain. And when we look at, okay, who is doing supply chain, we found out that Hyperledger is behind, right? Another case was that I liked the idea of enterprise because one of the things that grabbed my attention was the architecture of Hyperledger. It's very organized, it's a structure to scale it up. And the more you scale, the more application become complex, the more you appreciate the value of Hyperledger. Ethereum didn't know about this initially, but then later on, if you notice, look at Ethereum, enterprise, private, they came to realize that, okay, they need to have those components, but it still is not as structured as Hyperledger because at its core, Hyperledger is enterprise oriented.
What motivated you to write a book on it? How'd you
yeah,
that's a bit of an endeavor.
that was an endeavor. So a little bit. So I know people in O'Reilly Media, so I had some connection there, and my company did some training for them. For me, the challenging part, Eric, was to come up with a list of topics that's not going to be obsolete so early. I mean, like you have to come up with a list of topics that are practical and it's going to stay around for a few years to come. So for me, to put it this way, almost half of the challenge of the book, that outline. And then to be honest, at that time, I underestimate because, lately the O'Reilly told me that this book become #1 in the market. But had I known that, and blockchain changes very fast. So some of the things that like asset tokenization wasn't that much, hype at that time. Because once you submit the outline, you're not going to change it. It's like a little bit difficult for O'Reilly to accept them. Okay, I'm make changes to this. So that was most challenging. And it was a very rewarding experience for me because it was a one time and it was so arduous task. It's just hard to put it in words.
Yeah, it's certainly a labor of love. The longer it gets. So kudos to you for taking on that challenge. So before even diving into maybe breaking down Hyperledger a little bit, let's just talk a little bit about just public and private blockchain integration generally. Now, I think most of the listeners understand that when you're talking about more of a private blockchain or a DLT technology, they work particularly well in closed systems, obviously, and specific concerns that you're trying to address within a closed system. But the integration of private and public is intriguing and certainly a direction. Like everything can't be, and as Ethereum noted, and you've noted, or as Ethereum has provided for and started to attack this notion of private blockchains, closed network, and then facilitating the blockchains within a closed network, and then from that closed network or that private blockchain, then integrating with the public with APIs or what have you as necessary. But and certainly one thing we talked about with OneChain, we talked about this notion of a compliance blockchain that might exist within a closed network. We also talked a little bit about that with regards to anti-money laundering compliance with Dave Jevons of CipherTrace, how you might have separate networks just specifically for AML whitelisting and KYC checks, et cetera, that would then integrate back into the public blockchain, maybe even like a DApp. But having said that, when we think in terms of private public blockchains, just sort of broadly, what are the most compelling use cases for that integration?
Yeah, that's a good point. So you see, at the very high level, when we talk about private and public, right, as you mentioned, some of the things that you need to watch for, like public, for example, cybersecurity is one of the issues that's more appealing to the public because it's open to the public and, attackers can attack. But private one is just closed, is more secure in general speaking, right? And the gas price of the Ethereum was low, but now look at the competition. Everyone entered to that, and then gas price goes up. So that's another area. Now, coming back to the integration of the private. So private, basically, once you build that, the members of the network is already known. They know each other. We already have a kind of the agreement with them. And then they start build that network, and any persons in that network is just part of the network. So there's no outsider. Now, on the public, like Ethereum, it's open to public. Now, Regarding the use cases, some of the use cases that is dealing with publics, like for example, like asset tokenization, crowdfunding, some of these cases that you need the public to come in and participate in your applications. Obviously, choice number one is called public blockchain. On the other hand, when you're dealing with closed network or closed net, and then you're dealing with like mostly business to business or some stuff that there's no participation of the public involved, then you would rather go to a private. Now, the ideal choice sometimes become kind of the hybrid, because some of the applications have both element of public and private, right? As you mentioned, like know your customers, anti-money laundering, right? KYC. You can have a standalone application for that. We have done that for a bank where we build a standalone application for know your customers, and then they have their own others platform. So one example is like this. So when we are dealing with architecture of the blockchain, right? So then you might have a different, like there is one master application, and under that you might have kind of the, slave, kind of the another layer of the application, right? And each one of those applications might have, may maneuver publicly or privately, right? If that's public, for example, then you're gonna use the, right platform like Ethereum, or is it private, you're gonna use Hyperledger. But coming back, I think the most important part of the blockchain to me is architecture. So the first thing you have to identify is the blockchain is the right solution. And if yes, what is the best architecture for me for this, what I'm building? And without any bias to say, okay, you know what, I know this platform, I know that platform. Platform comes at the very technical state. At the architecture, you need to realize, okay, what is the best, most efficient way for me I can achieve my goal and my business requirement, my business goal. And once you draw that, then you can come up and say, okay, you know what, now I have this. What is the next available tools for me or available platform to achieve this?
Right. And so just to double click on that a little bit, in contemplating the architecture, and again, trying to break it out at a high level, what are the primary considerations within contemplating the architecture to make that determination?
Yeah. See, one of the key consideration is a data flow, right? So where the data originate and where the data goes and who need to see the data, at what scope they need to see the data, right? If the right data go to wrong hand, it's just is not good. So basically that's, as a data is a very good starting point to see how the data flows in your model. And then also to see how many kind of the people involved, how many kind of the nodes of people, parties involved in that, and to what extent their roles are. And then obviously in any product that you have, if the public involved, the public it's so obvious, like black and white. If you have some element of customers in public, that, okay, they are there, and you cannot just discriminate. If it's public, it's public, it's private, private, right? So if there is an element of public involved. So my suggestion is just look at your the data flow. If this data can be available to public, like Ethereum, is okay. So but if it's not, if there's a mixture of public and private, then you need to have a hybrid, right? So this is a good starting point for developers. And also, again, look at your customers or client. If it's public customers, like anyone can buy it, like crowdfunding, or it's just it is certain people like trade finance that they can access them.
Right. And just to sort of weave a thread through a lot of our past podcast episodes and focus, key to it is also encryption and the ability to implement encryption, whether it's zero knowledge proofs, which arguably could be done on a public blockchain. But then if you start moving to encryption technologies such as multi-party computation, arguably could be done public. You might find that certain implementations would suggest that you'd be better off on a private. And certainly when you start to move into things like fully homomorphic encryption or somewhat homomorphic encryption, that could be within a private blockchain, and then integrating, via the public blockchain, ZKP might be a prime way to sort of integrate the two. So yeah, a lot of different puzzle pieces there, right?
Yes, exactly. There's so many variations. So many variables there to take into consideration, as you mentioned. Again, the cybersecurity is one aspect, because I was speaking with one of those guys. He does cybersecurity. He has a book on the cybersecurity, and he told me that, look, right now, many old versions of Ethereum are under the attack. But this is not the case with Hyperledger because, again, it's a closed network, is relatively more secure. So basically, many developers who does stuff in Ethereum, they underestimate the importance of the security, and they just, we'll cross the bridge when we come to it, but sometimes it's so risky, especially for ICO, security token offering is so risky. You can't just doing like that. And I have seen some project that people really underestimate this, but it's just that one of the things that Ethereum is changing, because as you know, the proof of stake is coming up right now. There's so much concern in the Ethereum community regarding the environmental effect that they have because of the proof of work. So their consensus is going to be updated later this year. It's proof of stake, which is going to help a lot in terms of the resources that they're going to utilize to add the transaction to their network.
For sure, for sure. And it's interesting because, the cybersecurity component really underscores the importance of third-party independent audit of code, and obviously security being one component, and bounties to sort of encourage people to try to find those breaks. I mean, you just had, what was it, the Poly network that had that massive $600 million hack. And then basically, I think I read just the other day that all the monies have been returned, and it was done to largely expose. But things like that are important to underscore the vulnerability on a lot of the public blockchain developments. I mean, the same can exist on any private blockchain.
Yeah.
Matt's thinking to himself, hold it, I came on to talk about Hyperledger Fabric version 2. He's jumping off on all these different topics.
Yes,
Eric,
yes.
let's get back to, but it all kind of factors in. Certainly one thing it appears, and maybe you can validate, that Hyperledger, because there's less, pardon the pun, but maybe not really, because of it doesn't have the same hype that a lot of like public blockchain protocols have. So, because it's enterprise, a lot of that cybersecurity focus is sort of inherited maybe from the enterprise implementation level. Larger enterprises use it. They have their own CISOs and cybersecurity that run through it as part of their implementation for the project. So you're not dealing with startups, you're dealing with, enterprise grade, and it forces that greater attention on the security of the DLT from the start. So with that said, to kind of bring us back to Hyperledger. So there are a number of distributed ledger technologies within the Hyperledger family, I guess is one way to call it. Could you kind of give us a brief sketch of what they are?
Yeah, so regarding the distributed ledger technology, or DLT, under the Hyperledger, there is a Hyperledger Fabric, as you know, Hyperledger Sawtooth, and then Indy, and Iroha, Besu, and Grid. So very briefly, like maybe one sentence about each so that you can remember what it is. So Fabric, we talk about Fabric today, so I just skipped that one. The Hyperledger Sawtooth is originated by Intel company. It's very efficient resources-wise. He utilizes resources very wisely, like hardware, the processors of the computer. And it's on the Sawtooth, you can use both permission and permissionless part of the network. That's the flexibility that it has. Also, Sawtooth, in each node in the Sawtooth, each node on the Sawtooth can be orderer. Okay, if you are familiar with Hyperledger Fabric, you know that it's fantastic. That means performance. Because in Hyperledger Fabric, there is only one node act for the whole network as orderer. But in the Sawtooth, each node can act on that. So that's make it more efficient performance-wise. Now, Hyperledger Indy and Iroha, both of them for identity management and for encrypting, identity management of the, and then Hyperledger Grid is a specific distributed ledger technology, which is still at the incubation stage for supply chain management. Hyperledger Besu, one of the key features of Hyperledger Besu, which is still, I think, is at incubations, is support many consensus algorithms, proof of work, proof of stakes, it just has that ability. And Hyperledger Besu is also kind of the open source Ethereum client. So that's why I'm saying, for example, whenever you want to do the hybrid, Fabric and Besu, they're like twin, they come together because Fabric is a private, Besu is create the bridge between that and Ethereum.
Circling back to Sawtooth, because with Sawtooth, you talk about permissioned and permissionless, and you talked about there being the potential for more than one node validator, right?
Yes. And then you see on the Sawtooth, you can structure the Sawtooth as being completely permissionless, like Ethereum. or it can be permissioned like a Hyperledger. So it has that flexibility.
So how does Sawtooth differ from Fabric? So Fabric is permissioned, Besu is permissionless, and Sawtooth is theoretically both. Am I
Yeah,
pseudo correct?
yeah. See, so Fabric is a private. I put this with private, right?
Yep.
Sawtooth can be private or public, so it has that flexibility. Now, on the Fabric, there is one orderer or ordering service for doing all the transaction, but on the Sawtooth, each node has the ability to become orderer of its own without going to the central like authority, to do that. So it makes it more efficient in terms of giving resources.
Right. So it could be somewhat similar to just validators on an Ethereum network
Yes, exactly.
or Bitcoin or what have you. So you can have multiple nodes validating it. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And is the reason that people wouldn't go to Sawtooth exclusively because of its flexibility that Fabric and Besu just have more functionality within
to be
each
honest,
of their focuses?
it's just that the people go to Fabric because there's so much resources available, right? And
Right.
then also there's a community for Fabric. Plus, you see, for example, like IBM or all these cloud providers, they really have a specific managed services for Fabric on the blockchain. Now, for the Sawtooth, again, the initial idea was for Sawtooth was that like resource efficient, like hardwares, the CPU because of that architecture. At the same time, not every project need that kind of the efficiency, because at the same time, again, the pros and cons is that the cons you have to watch for all the validators, right? It's just that it's pros and cons and also a support from community. But so put it this way, the project that go to the Sawtooth, they know what they are doing. So they are really looking for something very resource efficient. But in general, when you're talking about general project with Fabric, this is not the demand. This is not a priority. This is not the first objective of project, right?
Right. Because generally the private networks aren't going to be as active as, let's say, the public networks, right?
Yes,
In terms of traffic and resource efficiency, et cetera. Excellent. So then let's double click on Hyperledger Fabric, where the resources are and where most in the audience would be kind of focused on, at least initially. So what are the key components? We talked about one, which is that it's permissioned. But what are the key components of Hyperledger Fabric?
Yeah, so the Hyperledger key component are like, as I said, orderer, and then it can be a membership service provider, MSP, and it can also be kind of the peers, and then it can also be a private data, or there is something features on Hyperledger Fabric too called private data collection. I'm going to a little bit talk about that, and then chain code, and then channel and policies. So if I can put like chain code means a smart contract. So in the Fabric allows to have multiple smart contract to be chained together under the same umbrella. So it gives him, that's why it gives you a structure of the very high performance network tool. So you can have 100, 550 smart contract under the same umbrella and they sync to each other under the chain code. And then, so there's a chain code, there is an orderer, so membership service provider. His job, MSP or membership service provider, his job is to manage all the identities of the people participating, like access control lists, who have access to what, when, where. And then, of course, there is something called the policies. Policies define the members of this network who can do what and what's, like define all these policies that regulate the participant in the network. And then the things is that peers are the one that the one that they are actually having a ledger on them, right? Ledger. And then from the ledger, as you know, like Ethereum, there is on the ledger data, like CouchDB database, and then off the ledger data. And then there is one Hyperledger libraries that facilitate off the chain data processing securely. And you can hook up your Fabric to that one too.
That's interesting. And going back to was it the on-chain smart contracts, or the linked smart contracts? What was it called again? I'm sorry.
Chain code.
Chain quote. So does that have the ability to both to integrate linked smart contracts with, within the private network, and then in the public network and then in the private network? In other words, can it sort of weave its way by integrating more public smart contracts into the framework?
No. See, the chain code is only for Fabric and is only for private and is only for those smart contract under them. And again, if you
Right.
want to see the Fabric, there is a library in the Fabric that you can use to make the smart contract agnostic to platform and runs by itself regarding the platform. So if you want to do that, then you just use that to connect with the Fabric so that they can translate your contract to the platform agnostic. But I'm saying in the Fabric itself, the chain code is only for private, is only for people, and you deploy the chain code on a specific node that's required to be deployed, right? Another fascinating part of the Fabric that is good to mention is channel. Channels allow a certain parties in a network to have a certain communication without affecting the operation of it. So that's why it's meant for the enterprise. So let's say that the pharmaceutical supply chain from manufacturers to suppliers, distributors, there's a certain operation that they need to communicate like a private channel. They can create a private channel and then they can start doing that communication without affecting the other operations of the network.
Now, would that be similar to how an Oracle might integrate with a smart contract?
Yes, similar. Again, one thing is that at the same time, there's some little bit differences, but the name signifies like channel is there is a way, there's a channel where certain parties, so basically admin in the Hyperledger Fabric assigns, okay, this is a channel between these certain members that they can communicate under that channel. And again, channels are very, very good. And then policy is very good. Master service providers is very elegant in managing all the identities of the members, all the IDs of the participant in the network. Obviously, you understand all of this when you are, as I said, scaled up to the consortium. When you scale up the consortium, you realize that, okay, there's so many members, then you have to have some policies among them because because they're different companies, right? How we can have 5 different private companies, you have to establish a policy among them. And that's how the Walmart is doing, because Walmart set the policies to their suppliers and they just follow them.
And going back to the smart contract and integration, like whether channels, but also talking a little bit about oracles, right? So like there's a company, API3 DAO. We had Sasa Milic on the podcast to talk about it. They provide like an open API framework to different oracles, and that can be integrated off-chain and on-chain. Could a company that does this like API3 DAO or also like a Chainlink, can they be the Oracle provider to these smart contracts on Hyperledger Fabric, or do they have to?
Yeah, but
is that just an API, or do they have to actually somehow become a member of that fabric? And is that simpler than it may sound?
So I think what there's a difference between the smart contract deployment on the node and invocation of smart contract, right? Because when you're invoking a smart contract, this is just a query. Like you go to a website, you search something, that's a query, right? So that one, yes, you don't need to even worry about that. Oracles can access and invoke like a public, like right now, for example, you can run a query from something API. You just call the API, fetch the data. So that is just a query. And obviously that query is possible. Yep. If that private company allowed the query, the fetching of the data or invocation is possible. However, the deployment, no. And you don't need to deploy them because, as you mentioned, they are doing the stuff between on and off the chain, right? The data, because you're not going to put so much stuff on the chain. So there's the stuff off the chain. And then if you want to invoke something from on the chain, then you can do that, no problem. But you don't need to deploy. See, that's the difference between deployment of the smart contract to be on the node and operate versus the invoking that. So in case that you are talking right now is invoking, and invoking, there's no problem. I mean, like oracles and others can invoke that.
Excellent. So I know that's probably a simple question for you, but it just something I wanted to cover off just because the way it's one of the key components there. So Hyperledger Fabric, we talked a little bit about their use cases. What would be, if you wanted to give, let's say, the top 3 actual industry use cases for Hyperledger Fabric where they're having meaningful, impactful, sort of a no-brainer deployment?
Yeah, I think so the first and foremost is supply chain management, as you know. And then second of importance is identity management. As I mentioned, you can use Hyperledger Fabric, Indy, Iroha, all this. There is another library that you can use for identity management. So that's the second one. And after that, so you know that there are so many use cases of blockchain, right? So many. So after that, I think the most popular would be anything that deals with private B2B, I would say. Anything private B2B, like trade finance or anything that like asset tokenization between two different entities, anything that is private B2B, I think the Fabric would be fantastic.
Interesting, and certainly for private B2B, it's we a few weeks ago we had the what was going on in Congress with the IRS and the taxation of crypto. Obviously, it has an impact on the Hyperledger use case as well, right? It's not just a public blockchain issue; it's a private blockchain issue as well, particularly if it's B2B.
Yes, to some extent, but I am not sure, because the thing is that on the Fabric, the consensus algorithm is different, right? And then the parties involved, they own the node, right? So it's private node that they have. Like, for example, your computer, my computer, we are sharing some of the stuff in your computer, right? So it's a little bit different. I mean, it's very difficult for government even to come and audit that, because it's private. You cannot just go to a company to see what data is shared between. So for Fabric, I doubt that they can really enforce on the Fabric, because it's just the private data. And then plus the consensus algorithm is different, right? Because there is no third party like a miner that they can say, oh, they are working and there is a proof of their work, and then we get the money, right? So it's done like by itself, by the system. But at the same time, again, all I'm saying is that, Eric, I cannot pass any judgment. I may be wrong,
Oh, I know.
I may be wrong, but it's just that, the IRS gonna squeeze anything as far as they can, right? So my thing is that for me, it's very difficult to imagine, but it's not impossible.
Right. I mean, the impact of it is really forcing reporting of B2B to asset transfers on the private on Hyperledger is what it would require. So it would require a level of reporting that isn't potentially already done. Again, maybe because it's enterprise, there's a more ready capability to implement that. Who knows? But anyway, this is our podcast first deep dive on Hyperledger. So
yes, exactly.
And it's certainly not going to be the last. So moving on to version 2. Version 2, that's the second version. Obviously, that is the essence of what you're trying to cover in your book, not only covering Fabric, but how it's now improved and how it can be, and how that improvement can really impact its use cases and draw, additional features. So what are some of the new functional features offered in V2? I guess just in order of, to the extent you can, in order of impact, and help us understand, why those are impactful.
You see, one thing is that, most of the, like, for example, right now, AWS and, some of the AWS, and I'm not sure about Oracle, but AWS right now is the most popular, cloud platform, and they support version 1.6, I believe. And interesting enough, starting the April of this year, Fabric Hyperledger community, they are not supporting that version anymore, becoming like obsolete. And so that opens the door for vulnerabilities and risk, because once they stop supporting that, they're not patching up anymore. So I think Amazon is behind these things. They are preparing, because IBM is version 2 and Oracle is version 2. I just remember Oracle is version 2, IBM is version 2, just AWS is behind. Now, even the Alibaba is version 2. So one thing is that, coming back to the version, so as you know that over the time, the community realized that some features are missing and some of the things need to be fixed. And then some of the key highlight of the version 2, of the most notable one, is a small contract lifecycle management, or it's called chain code lifecycle management. And it's one of the crucial, very important element of the enterprise. So over the time, business requirement changes, and you need to change your smart contract, adopt that. But it's not that easy for the blockchain that runs by itself, right? So you have to come up with a way to manage different versions of your, smart contract, and then upgrade that without minimum effect on the network, right? So it was lacking in the previous versions. And version 2, they came and said, okay, we have something called a smart contract lifecycle management. So you can easily manage different versions of the smart contract. And over the time, you can obsolete the old one that's not using anymore. So that is the fantastic features that came. And we talk about that in our book. And then also private data collections, as we talked earlier. It allows certain members in a network to have a private chat with one another without getting approval of order or going to the main network. So it facilitates, makes things faster, communication and in the network among the participants. It's also support of the raft because in version 1.c, the consensus of the raft was next to the Kafka, and Kafka was at that time like most dominant. In earlier version of the.
So there's a couple of terms that you just threw out there that I wasn't ready. So it was the. So could you go through that
so
again?
One was maybe... So in initial version of the fabric, the consensus was Kafka. And then later on, they add the raft in version 6. So there was raft and Kafka. But in version 2 forward, they don't accept Kafka anymore. It's only raft, R-A-F-T, raft.
What does that stand for?
Yeah. And then, so the thing is that if you have done something in the fabric, it's going to immediately ring the bell because these are so much done in the fabric. Like if you're doing anything in fabric, you're going to run into Kafka or the raft. Now, Kafka was Java-based, right? To give you, was Java-based, and then Raft is a Golang, language, Go. So basically, they just moved that, and then coming back. Another things I forgot to mention is that it's very important for people listening to this question they might have, and we skip that. If I want to write a smart contract in Fabric, what are my language choices? The good news is that we can do JavaScript, as simple as JavaScript. You don't need to learn Solidity, So as simple as JavaScript. In our book, we talk about JavaScript. But if you want to do the, more heavy duty, like Go or Java, you can do those languages too, even Python. Now, another features that offered in version 2 is called external chain code launcher, right? And coming back to what you mentioned, if you remember in your previous about Oracle, so this is another feature that's called external chain code or smart contract launcher. So you can call the smart contract without being in the network. So that features it offered in version 2. And that's where the Oracle that you were talking can benefit from that.
Interesting. So it definitely provides greater, public-private
interactions.
Cross-chain interaction, cross-chain functionality. Interesting. And to take one step back, particularly on the smart contract lifecycle management, how would you compare and contrast the functionality of Hyperledger smart contract lifecycle management with what occurs on the public blockchain today?
So the thing is that as far as I'm not adept on Ethereum, to be honest. It's like I just read the book like 2 years ago that Ethereum's doing some of the stuff on that kind of lifecycle management. But it's very important. Now, coming back, if I notice, I mentioned business requirement, right? So in the public blockchain network, I am not sure how, for example, non-fungible token, once you put it up there, it's the business requirement. I'm not sure how fast it's going to change. But it's not the case with private business. Private business, I'm guessing the requirement are not only change more frequently, but the effect of change are more important because you have to adopt those changes rapidly. You know what I mean? And you cannot afford. But it's not the case with the public. You're dealing with public, right? Like for Ethereum, the most important things that you're going to do is to update your version. Because as I said, for the risk and cybersecurity, right? You have the oldest versions. Now you need to deploy it to put the new latest versions. You're not dealing with like 20 different contracts or 10 different smart contracts that they need to update and talk to each other. So they don't have that level of complexity, right? Nevertheless, again, Ethereum has that options, right? Has that options. Have I seen the developers often use that? No, as far as I've seen it. But then when it comes to the private blockchain, it is a must because I'm guessing that right now, if the government or someone serious want to deploy the private blockchain, if they're going to ask this question, hey guys, have you taken kind of the due diligence or precautions about, okay, what happened? This thing's going to become obsolete. I have heard from a couple of our clients. okay, you know what, we do this, but 2 years from now, what if it's going to go away or this going to change, And again, initially we didn't have an answer for them, but now recently, thanks to this, because before this, it was a nightmare. You have to redeploy everything, you do the unit test, everything. It just was so much work. So it's like saves a lot of time and effort for developers. And also it gives a peace of mind and, just to the enterprises that look, it's just going to be like a software. You install your software like Microsoft Windows on yours, and right now on your computer, you know that you don't need to worry about upgrade or patches. It automatically, done by itself. It's the same things with that kind of the lifecycle management.
So it seems that from at least your perspective, that if you're an enterprise that's contemplating nesting a series of smart contracts in a way that could be managed in a private network versus a public blockchain network, the ability to manage that life cycle and to control it and to upgrade it would be enhanced if you were in, let's say, in Hyperledger Fabric. Is that
it's going to be
your
enhanced?
perspective?
And also in general, the kind of the complexity of smart contract for the private might be more, especially for enterprise and consortium, compared to the public. So that's really demand that you just watch for that and upgrade that. So again, coming back, the thing is that I haven't dig into see the application of that lifecycle management in Ethereum or public. All I know is that some of the use cases that I've seen right now, they have 1 or 2 or 3 smart contract on Ethereum public blockchain network, and the only things they need to do upgrade that, and they are not going to change that much. For example, OpenSea, if you look at OpenSea for non-fungible token, the smart contract has been around for a few years. They may upgrade the version, which I didn't see because I saw the other day that it was the same version. But what I'm saying is that it might not be the case for the private blockchain network because business requirement in general changes more in the private sectors than the public.
Interesting. So it's certainly something in terms of architecture. This would factor
Yes.
prominently in your decision making for which architecture. So this next question is actually a question that you suggested, but we might have covered it, which is, is hybrid blockchain architecture becoming trendy?
Yes, exactly. That's we covered already. An answer to that is yes. The public and private now become like twin and better. And a better kind of the dialogue right now, a better conversation than before, and they are merging. So because again, as I said, some of the companies that offer one blockchain, then they start offering another blockchain solutions, and sooner or later they run into a situation that is going to go to the. For example, I want to give you one example. Right, right now we're working on a SaaS product for reward and loyalty management, and so we started with building this product for the public. Like customers of the companies or e-commerce that get rewarded by token, right? But as we add more to it, when it comes to the point that we want to engage multiple companies to sell their product in the platform as a reward, then we are going to use the Fabric private so that they can do all the transaction B2B and on themselves. So as you see, even the public network that they start off, as they scale up to get to the point that they see the demand or need for the private one come to picture, or vice versa. So we are saying that as the market become more mature, as because initially there was a skepticism, there was hesitant, I'll do this, do that, but now people become more conscientious, become more aware of use cases of blockchain, and then become more comfortable, the expense of ether, things like that. So as we get to that point, I think we are getting to a point that these two different communities come together and they realize that, okay, they're going to support each other. It's not like I am a standalone, they're going to become part of the same ecosystem.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's certainly the impression that as the use cases for the public blockchain build out, it necessarily will cause private blockchains to mature and to integrate and to have more expansive technology. In other words, I think it's an inevitable partnership. I mean, there's X amount you can do on the public blockchain, but there's a higher degree of comfort in doing potentially more on the private blockchain and then integrating with the public blockchain. So I think I certainly expect Hyperledger to be a use case. The use cases for Hyperledger to start to be explored more even by public protocols and projects as they think about how do we expand our functionality. So if we're deploying and managing Hyperledger Fabric on the cloud, what options are there to the market?
Yeah, so first of all, one of the barriers right now exists for the Fabric developers is that unlike Ethereum, that you can deploy the Fabric on a test network for free, this option is not available in the Fabric because it's the private. And then there is a one cloud provider in China that they recently started offering a free service for testing the Fabric, but that's the only things available as to the best of my knowledge. So coming back for the cloud providers, so there are Amazon's, IBM, Oracle, and Alibaba. Azure, they shut down the blockchain cloud services like a few months ago, and that was disappointing because Azure was a very good platform for blockchain. But unfortunately, they are not doing it anymore. And then, so basically, right now the most popular one there are four. I think AWS is the first. They have managed services, which is very easy to deploy. And then IBM has, Oracle has. Oracle is very good that tied to their data analytic that they have because Oracle's base is a database, and then they have a very good off-the-chain, applications. And then IBM has been one of the key, the supporter of the Fabric at the beginning, at its core. And then the thing is that Alibaba is also catching up. They have a blockchain as a service that is very fantastic. It's just that in the United States, as you know, that Chinese cloud, they don't like Chinese cloud providers. So they're a little bit behind,
yes.
But they're coming with a very huge budget. I heard that.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely sounds like there's opportunities in the space if you want to break away from the usual suspects. I mean, I suspect that I don't know what's involved in maintaining that platform and why Azure backed out, whether cost was a component or whether they wanted to.
So one thing is that among these four, I mean, all of them are a little bit expensive, but if you look at the prices, that are more or less around the same price. It comes down to the ease of using and deploying. And because the way that cloud works is like this: if your company is already using the Oracle, most likely you're going to use the Oracle for blockchain. You're not going to switch to the IBM or AWS because all configuration, everything is so different. It's just you have a tendency, okay, we are using Oracle, okay, I'm going to use Oracle, yes or no. The only challenge that right now is there's so many, because Azure is the second cloud providers after AWS in the world. And once they announced that, it was a shock in the community. And then they said, okay, now that Azure is not there, where we go? So if your company is ever doing Azure, then for you is a decision. Okay, I'm going to go from Azure. What are these, which one of these four I need to select? But price-wise, are they around the same? It's just that, as I said, some of them coming with more features than the others. For example, if you want to do the data science analytic, Oracle is better.
All right, so we are continuing the last part of the podcast after a 24-hour interruption that started technically and then continued to scheduling. But we're at the end of the podcast with Matt. And Matt, if somebody is interested in learning more about Hyperledger who hasn't really followed it to date, both from a technical perspective, like as a developer, or as a just somebody trying to understand the capabilities, what's a good place to learn more?
Yeah, so basically the Hyperledger Foundation, hyperledger.org, they have a lot of very good resources for people who want to learn the Hyperledger. Now, a couple of very quick note is that, in order to learn the Hyperledger, you need to have some basic understanding of prerequisite of that. So like knowing how to use the Linux command or bash scripting, this is good, really needed for the administering or managing the Hyperledger network. And then if you want to do the Hyperledger development, you need to know at least one programming languages like JavaScript, Golang, Java. So this resource is Hyperledger website. And then if you want to learn more about other kind of the structured training, then we have coding boot camps that you can get training. Another thing is also is like that there are two major certifications in the Hyperledger. So one's called Certified Hyperledger for System Admin. another called Certified Hyperledger for Developer. These are very good two high-profile certification issued by the Linux Foundations. So if you want to validate your credential in the Hyperledger community and for your employers, make sure check these two certifications and then prepare for these two certifications.
Great. And then just before we get into how people can contact you, we talked a bit on this podcast on how Hyperledger is basically available through 4 enterprise cloud providers. We talked about, AWS, Oracle, Alibaba. What's the other one I'm missing? Sorry.
AWS, IBM, Oracle, and
IBM.
Alibaba.
Yeah, of course, IBM. So do you see a path where, it's certainly expensive, or I'm not going to say expensive, but it's more expensive than a public blockchain to deploy Hyperledger from a licensing and contracting with AWS. Do you foresee in the future maybe the cost of it coming down, maybe it being available on distributed platforms where it becomes almost as accessible or cost effective? I mean, listen, we can talk about cost effectiveness in terms of the value that you get out of it. But do you see the prices and the availability changing in a way that distributes it more widely in the future?
It's possible. Again, the idea is, as I mentioned, most of the existing participants in the Hyperledger community are companies, large companies, or mostly average to large company, medium to large companies that they afford. They have no problem with all this payment to the AWS, and so. But I really like what you're saying. I really like to see in the community. Because it make Hyperledger more widespread and may become more kind of the popular. So definitely be look forward to see that. But the one thing is that there is I'm gonna mention his link if someone contact me if someone wanna know about that. There is a cloud provider based in China that they offer free services like test network of the Ethereum for Hyperledger, and they are doing good. They are doing very good. So to answer your questions, it's very likely as more people start using Hyperledger and appreciate the value of private blockchain network, they're gonna look into that, and there are gonna be opportunities like that. But as of right now, again, most of the participants are private companies that they can afford. And again, for the developers, they can test on their own local machines, and that's what most developers right now they are doing. So they test everything on the local machines, and then when they're ready to deploy, they deploy it on the cloud.
Great. All right. Well, certainly something to continue to follow. I mean, maybe it's Hyperledger, maybe it's a protocol like Hyperledger. What's really nice about Hyperledger is the extent that it's been battle tested in an enterprise environment, and obviously for private blockchain, that would seem to give it a leg up, over some of the other public blockchain, like the Ethereum deployment for the private cloud. So, if people want to learn more about you, and where can they find you?
Yeah, so in the YouTube, down below the YouTube video that you're watching, there is a link to my LinkedIn. You can add me in LinkedIn. You can message me on LinkedIn, and then my company is hashfellow.us, hashfellow.us. And then also for the book, I'm gonna add the link in the YouTube video. You can buy it from the O'Reilly Media website, or you can buy it from the Amazon. So there's a link there. I have done a lot of public speaking for the Hyperledger community around Europe and United States. And I'm planning also have some talks about my book. So basically, once you add that in my LinkedIn, I'm going to share the information about my upcoming speaking engagement with regard to Hyperledger.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show and enlightening us on the Hyperledger fabric and the Hyperledger family and how it integrates in with the public blockchain. It's been great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for having me. And then it was a pleasure, speaking to you and your community. And I look forward to seeing more kind of the, more engagement on your community. If they have any question, I would be happy to discuss that with them after this. And have a wonderful morning, Eric, from New Jersey. Take care.